Hey everyone, and welcome to class. Today in our explainer, we're going to explore the absolutely fascinating history of how Southeast Asia changed dramatically after World War II. We're talking about how these countries finally grabbed their independence, the massive struggles they faced along the way, and how they built their very own governments from the ground up. It is an amazing story full of giant changes, so let's jump right in.
Here is what we're looking at today. We'll break this history into 5 quick parts: winning independence, the Vietnam War, the global Cold War, choosing a government, and finally, a quick summary of what the region looks like today.
All right, part 1, winning independence. Let's set the scene. For the longest time, almost all of Southeast Asia was actually ruled by Western countries. But during World War II, Japan took over the area. Well, when Japan was defeated in 1945, the people of Southeast Asia stood up and demanded their freedom.
Between 1945 and 1965, there was this massive, region-wide rush for freedom. You have the Philippines becoming independent in 1946, Myanmar in 1948, and others jumping in right after. Now, some of these countries won their freedom peacefully, with barely any fighting at all. But for others, the path was a whole lot harder.
Take Vietnam, for example. Their struggle was incredibly complicated. After local leaders declared independence, France tried really hard to keep control, but eventually they just had to pull their troops out of the north. So Western powers decided to collaborate, and collaborate is a super important key word for us today, meaning to work together. They collaborated to set up a new government in southern Vietnam. Because of this, the country was split right down the middle into 2 totally rival sides.
And that split brings us right into part 2, the Vietnam War. This was a major, devastating conflict that very quickly caught the attention of the entire world.
Things escalated so fast. In 1964, after an American naval ship exchanged gunfire with North Vietnamese boats, the United States sent hundreds of thousands of troops over to fight. But the fighting was just incredibly tough. In 1968, there were major, widespread attacks across the South. Back in the United States, the public really turned against the war, realizing it just couldn't be easily won. Eventually, U.S. troops withdrew in 1973, and by 1975, communist forces had completely taken over the South.
Now, before leaving, the United States did try to equip South Vietnam. Equip is another great keyword to remember. It means they supplied the local soldiers with the necessary gear, things like weapons and specialized training, hoping they could fight on their own. But as we just saw, despite those efforts, the South was ultimately taken over.
So, to really figure out why all of this happened in the first place, we need to zoom out. We have to look at the bigger global picture in part 3, the Cold War dominoes.
This whole period was dominated by what we call the Cold War. But it wasn't a war where the 2 main sides actually shot directly at each other. Instead, think of it as a massive rivalry for global influence. The major powers sponsored, basically paid for and supported other wars around the world. It was a way to spread their own ideas without ever having to fight face-to-face.
There was a huge fundamental difference between the 2 main sides of this global rivalry. On one side, you had the United States. They led countries with market economies. That's where regular people and independent businesses make most of the money decisions. On the exact opposite side, you had the Soviet Union, leading communist countries.
It is absolutely crucial we understand this word clearly. A communist system means the government has total control over all property and makes literally all the economic decisions. People don't own their own private businesses, the state just controls the whole shebang.
Because the United States wanted to stop this communist system from growing and spreading to new places, they adopted a super strict policy known as containment. Think of it like trying to put the communist system inside a tightly sealed box so it just couldn't spill over into other countries.
American leaders strongly believed in something called the domino theory. I want you to imagine setting up a long line of dominoes on a table. They honestly thought that if just one country became communist, communist rebels would be promoted in neighboring nations, and those neighbors would fall one by one exactly like a row of dominoes tipping over. That fear of the falling dominoes is exactly why the United States went into Vietnam in the first place.
All right, so the really crucial point here is that after all these wars ended and Western powers finally packed up and left the region, each Southeast Asian country had to make a massive choice. That brings us to part 4, choosing a government. They had to chart their very own path forward.
And the results? Well, they were vastly different across the region. Some places, like Laos and Vietnam, became strict communist dictatorships.
Other countries, like Malaysia and Singapore, held regular elections but still passed specific laws to limit democratic freedoms. Then you have the tiny nation of Brunei, which became a sultanate, ruled by an absolute monarch. And finally, you have nations that struggled incredibly hard to build true, lasting democracies.
Let's look at one specific example to see just how difficult this process was. Meet Sukarno, Indonesia's very first president. He was this highly charismatic, inspiring speaker who really helped his country win independence. And at first, Indonesia actually formed a democratic government. But later on, Sukarno canceled the elections, dismissed the parliament entirely, and took total authoritarian control over the country.
Eventually, though, Sukarno was forced out of office by the military after a failed coup. Now, coup is another essential vocabulary word for us today. It describes a sudden, forceful takeover of a government. When military leaders feel threatened or want to change, they sometimes use physical force to just seize control overnight. And sadly, we have to talk about how devastating authoritarian rule could be. In Cambodia, a communist group called the Khmer Rouge managed to take power, and by 1978 they had slaughtered at least 1.5 million of their own people. To put that into perspective, that was 1/5 of the entire country's population at the time. It is a deeply tragic reminder of what can happen when a government holds total, unchecked power over its citizens.
Even today, there is a giant tug-of-war happening all across Southeast Asia. On one side, you have heavy military power. In places like Myanmar and Thailand, the military imposes rules that actually give them veto power over elected leaders. But on the other side, you see strong popular opposition. Look at the Philippines and Indonesia in the 1980s and 90s, where regular, everyday citizens bravely marched in the streets to force dictators out and bring in fairly elected governments.
Which brings us to the end of our lesson today, Part 5, Summary of Southeast Asia Today. Let's do a quick wrap-up of what we've learned about this wonderfully complex region.
Here is our short summary list to keep in your notes. First, most of these nations successfully won their independence between 1945 and 1965, right after World War II. Second, the global Cold War and the intense fear of the domino theory fueled the completely devastating Vietnam War. And third, looking at today, the region is incredibly diverse. Governments vary widely, from strict dictatorships to everyday citizens actively struggling to build strong, lasting democracies.
Before we go, I want to leave you with this final thought to consider. When a country's freedom is suddenly ripped away by a military coup, how hard is it and how long does it actually take for regular citizens to get that freedom back? Think about that puzzle as you review today's lesson. Thanks for joining me in this Explainer Today class, and keep on learning.